Now, in terms of New World population before contact in 1492, one thing we have to understand is that it was very much populated, widely populated, in fact. Now, it is true that the vast majority of the population was found in what we call today Central America and South America. But that doesn't mean that North America was barely or sparsely populated. In fact, now estimates vary quite widely in this regard, but that's because the science behind it can't really be conducted with exact precision. But nonetheless, even though there's disparity in these figures, it does still highlight or underscore the degree to which it's highly populated. And according to this figure here, including both Americas, that's 40 million to 75 million. And at that time, before contact, this constitutes 15% of the world's population. And if we look at North America alone, again, much less populated than Central and South America, but still you have 4 to 5 million people, Native Americans there. Now, what happens, as you may already be aware of, after contact in 1492 and the subsequent decades and even centuries following that, is the transference of deadly pathogens, viruses, microbes, and bacteria, so forth, that are going to be transferred along what's called the Columbian Exchange and towards the native inhabitants. And these inhabitants had no immunological resistance towards. And basically what happens is a demographic catastrophe following contact. And in fact, if you look at the figure there, let's say we acknowledge 40 to 75 million. Let's say in 1492 there were 75 million. What's going to happen over the next century is that 90% of that and the generations after that, right, will perish within 1 century, within 100 years. So if we fast forward to 1600, 90% of that 75 million will perish, largely due to diseases, old world diseases, which will wreak havoc upon the new world. And indeed, this is one of the worst epidemics in human history. And in fact, some historians cite the 1500s in totality, right, the 16th century that is, as the century in human history marked by the greatest loss of life. And it's largely due to this event that I'm talking about, this demographic disaster. Not to mention all the epidemics that are happening in Europe at that time. All right, now, going fast forward to the census in 1890, obviously, the United States is already in existence. The census counted only 250,000 Native Americans. By the way, why is 1890 important here? Because in that year, the census declared the frontier as closed. That the country, the United States, no longer had a frontier that was unexplored. Stated otherwise, we had reached the shores from sea to shining sea, so to speak, from east coast to west coast. And we had established the boundary of the United States by then. And when they conducted census, only 250,000 Native Americans were accounted for. So how do you wrap your head around that? What's happening here is something we'll discuss a little bit later, but this is what historians call racial replacement. Okay, where one entire race pretty much is replaced by another within a given amount of time. So this is what happens officially, so to speak, by 1890. And again, we'll engage with this question further. Now, what about the people that traversed the Atlantic Ocean and would end up exploring and colonizing, settling the Americas? Okay, so now we'll very briefly discuss, for lack of time, you can spend a lot of time on discussing the old world before contact, But again, who are these people coming across the Atlantic, quote unquote, discovering it from their perspective, of course? These were the Europeans. And by the way, this depiction before you in the slide is a depiction of the old world before contact. This is a world map, so to speak, from the European point of view. And the only world that they were aware of is obviously Europe here, certainly Africa, and stretching into Asia. This is what we call the old world, as we acknowledged earlier. Now, you may have heard that most people believed that the earth was flat back then. But I have to say, most uneducated persons did believe that. But if you were educated, which at that time was a very, very narrow slice of the population, but if you were educated, or if you were an explorer like Columbus and others, you knew that the world was round. But again, the vast majority believed it was flat. It's kind of like we're seeing Europe, Africa, Asia, right? This is the extent of the entire world. And, from the commerce point of view, it's flat. And this is the European mindset, right? They had no idea that half of the world existed across the way. So again, this is a world map, a global map, right, in 1490. So what about the people who traversed the Atlantic? Well, the colonizers, the Europeans again, were coming from that particular part of the old world. Okay, Europe. They weren't coming from China. They weren't coming from Africa or the Islamic civilizations or what we call the Middle East today. And also during this period in history, in European history, this is what the historians refer to as the early modern period, which spanned between, let's say, 1400 and 1750. And just as the name suggests, early modern, this is a period in European history where Europe was starting to escape from the medieval era. Also, it used to be called the Dark Ages, right? The Middle Ages, also referred to. And in many ways, at that time, it's escaping from the Dark Ages. And as the name suggests, it's backwards, right? Certainly more backwards than other parts of the old world, especially Asia. And I should mention this, Asia was the wealthiest and technologically advanced area of the world, of the old world before contact in 1492. And indeed, talking about wealth, Columbus and other European explorers, a big reason why they were, braving the oceans here was the attempt to find riches. It was guided by, wealth acquisition, right? You may have heard that Columbus was trying to reach Asia, right? And why Asia? Because he wanted to establish trade relations and acquire wealth. Of course, mistakenly, he thought he landed in India and began to call them Indians. Colossal error there. All right, but certainly China, okay, the Ming Empire, as it was called, the Ming Dynasty in the 1400s. You also had a great empire in India at that time. So these two particular regions were the wealthiest parts of the old world. And even the Islamic region, what we call the Middle East again, you had a lot of wealth through that Islamic trade system. And even in parts of Africa, which was very rich in terms of raw materials, specifically gold. Okay, by the way, there's a famous story of an African king, Muslim king, who was making his pilgrimage to Mecca, and he gave away so much gold in his travels that it caused this sort of economic inflation crisis, right, in the region. In any case, that demonstrates how there was wealth in these parts of the old world. Europe, in comparative terms, I'm not saying it was completely poor, but it definitely was less wealthy compared, particularly to Asia. And in fact, just to reemphasize, There's a reason why the Spanish Empire and the English Empire and the French Empire, why they're trying to get to China and India. It's because they wanted to forge trade relations. So again, this is the early modern period, and you may have heard that just a little before this time, there was a period called the Renaissance in Europe, where Europe is experiencing this cultural and intellectual rebirth, so to speak. You had the beginning of science, Galileo and so forth. You had the beginning in Europe of early capitalism, the very first stages of capitalism. Certainly doesn't resemble capitalism as it is today, hardly so, but it's the very beginning stages, and it's leaving behind the previously dominant system of feudalism during the medieval period. So take note of this, that this economic transformation, that is to say, feudalism towards capitalism in world history, is a major theme in this course. In fact, in the colonies, the English colonies that we'll discuss, certainly with the formation of the United States, this transition towards capitalism is an important theme. So again, I'm introducing it at this juncture of the course. We'll certainly talk more about the transition from feudalism to capitalism as this course is underway. Now, again, Europe is a bit behind, but it's undergoing change, as I just mentioned, right? They're developing certainly intellectually, culturally, technologically, economically. They're making innovations in seafaring, enabling farther voyages. This is going to be crucial because they need to cross, right, the Atlantic to reach the Americas. So this raises the question, why was it that the Europeans ended up traversing the Atlantic and, quote-unquote, discovering the New World? Why was it not, let's say, some civilization in Asia? Why was it not the Islamic traders? Why the Europeans? If in fact at this time they were considered behind other civilizations in the world, and even in large degree even more backwards, again, comparatively speaking. And by the way, I should mention this, that during the early 1400s in China, during this Ming Dynasty, you had the most powerful and wealthiest empire in the entire world, and the Ming Dynasty fleet was renowned for not only their technology, especially with shipbuilding, but also the degree to which they explored the old world, right, at that time. And it was not only a military fleet, but it was also a fleet created for trade. In fact, I encourage you to Google, the Ming Dynasty fleet, and if you see the image of a Ming ship, it dwarfs that of, that of the European ship, right? The huge ships. So the Ming Dynasty fleet certainly could have discovered, so to speak, America, right? Why didn't they? By the way, just to give you the answer to this, right? And again, this is in the early 1400s. Well, basically the Ming emperor who sponsored this fleet ended up dying, and he was replaced by a different Ming emperor. And that new emperor basically wanted to change the Chinese outlook, right? Away from merchant activity, trading, which was viewed with suspicion by Confucianism. Instead, the new emperor said, we're going to disband this fleet. Let's focus on returning to Confucian ethics. Not only that, he wanted to, use his resources to fight his internal enemies. So it was a shift in focus, right? Which was led to this overnight disbanding of this mighty fleet that at that time one could only marvel at.